Begin the current Daf, this Eruvin Daf Samach Vav. We begin on the top line of the Yomid. We continue the discussion for the previous Daf regarding Rabbi Yochanan's teaching when the non-Jew comes on Shabbos to be able to rent his rights in the domain, and then for every single Jew in the domain to then be mevatel, nullify their rights, to give it to one Yid, so that then at least they could carry from that Yid's house to that Rishus. Ashir's co-sponsor of Chazak to Anita Tavachayim. Appreciate everyone joining us for today's Daf. Some ideas we're discussing today's Daf are, like we mentioned, when the non-Jewish owner came home on Shabbos, Rabbi Yochanan confirmed they can rent from the non-Jew on Shabbos, which that's machlekes that was brought in the Gemara. Regarding what Rabbi Lazar says, 3 rules by Shmuel: when is bittul b'shus a viable option, and when is it not? Then we have machlekes Abai and Rava. They debate the issue of bittul b'shus between 2 chatzeros. What's exactly, there's different configurations of 2 chatzeros that open up to each other. Machlekes Abai and Rava regarding when you could do bittul b'shus and when not. Some important terms and concepts are bittul b'shus. Bittul b'shus is a halacha that if, let's say, someone forgot to join or wasn't able to join in the Eruvin, then he could nullify his rights. The whole halacha of Eruvin is that you're not allowed to carry in the common area because it might be confused with Yirubin. So the Chacham made a halacha of Eruv. Eruv is like we're all together in one house. One house can carry into the Chatzar. Let's say one person forgot to give the Eruv. He can then give up his rights. So then it's still going to be considered as a singular domain because he's not making it into a pluralistic, a common area because he has no rights. That's halacha bittul rishus. Halacha of shiur rishus is by a non-Jew. The Chachamim wanted to make it difficult for a person to live with the non-Jews because you might come to learn from the non-Jews. So therefore, they made that you have to rent the rights from the non-Jew. The non-Jew's not going to want to. You're going to move out. You can live only with Yidden. That's the halacha of shiur rishus. And then the concept of shtei chatzer zula from the mizu is one of the configurations of when you have 2 courtyards opening up one to the other. If one is within the other one, the only way to get from the inner courtyard to the Rishus Harabim is to go through the outer courtyard. That is when the inner courtyard has what's called Drisas Haregel. They have a right of way through the outer courtyard, and hence they can make it forbidden on the outer courtyard to carry unless they have a name. So we started this conversation already on the previous daf, where Reb Chanina bar Yosef, Reb Chia bar Abba, and Rav Asi, they went to this pundik. They went to this inn. 3 Amorim went to an inn where only Jews were staying. So they made an Eruvin Erev Shabbos. Then the non-Jewish owner came home on Shabbos. Now what happens is that when the non-Jewish owner is there, he nullifies the Erev, as Taisa explains. There's no more Erev anymore, because you can't make an Erev when there's a non-Jew over there. They have to rent the rights from him, and they didn't because he wasn't here on Erev Shabbos. So then, what's the halacha? They said, can we rent the rights of the non-Jew on Shabbos? And besides renting the rights of the non-Jew on Shabbos, then they're going to have to, okay, so now they rent the rights, but now there's no more Erev, and you can't make an Erev on Shabbos. Then you're going to have to go ahead and be mevatel Yerusha to one guy, so it's like one guy's there, and then you can carry out from that guy's house. That was machlekes, but first, the first step of this is, can you rent the rights of the non-Jew in Shabbos? What was the question? Do we say that seicha is kama Arab dami? Do we say that renting is like making an Eruv, which is asr on Shabbos? Or do we say that seicha is kama vat rishus dami, that it's like, that renting is like relinquishing one's rights in the domain which is called bittul rishus, which is mutter to be done on Shabbos, which we'll learn later on in this Masechta. So they relied on the senior amongst them, Reb Chanina bar Yosef, and he says nisker that they could rent from the non-Jew on Shabbos, and that's what we left off where on the top of this Amud Rabbi Yochanan says Yafa sisim shesachartem, you did well that you rented. That's where our conversation, our daf continues, where Rabbi Yochanan was of the opinion that bittul rishus, that shiur is like bittul rishus, renting the rights from the non-Jew is like bittul rishus, just like you allowed to be involved rishus on Shabbos in contrast to making Erev has to be done before Shabbos. So here also you're allowed to rent the rights on Shabbos, and then go ahead and be mevatel rishus to one of the Jews, and then you could carry in that end. So that's where the Gemara continues. Toiber Nahardoim. They wondered on this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan that he says you could do these 2 things of renting from the non-Jew and then doing bittul rishus even on Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan really say this? But Rabbi Yochanan himself said this following teaching. He said, "Seicher renting the rights from the non-Jew is kama Arab dami. It's like making the Eruv. My love, isn't it that what he was saying was, just like making the Eruv you have to do from before Shabbos, so to renting the right to non-Jew has to be from before Shabbos. How can he himself say, that you rented the right on Shabbos? It's kama Arab, it's like the other opinion. Says Himalai, no. Rabbi Yochanan was comparing Seichet and Eruv leniently, not stringently. Like Rashi says, Kol be'Eruvin lahakol. all halachas of Eruvin we make leniently. So in regards to the halacha of being done on Shabbos, that it's not like an Erev, that's like Bit Rishus, you can do it on Shabbos. This, however, that he's comparing it to the laws of Eruvin of renting from the non-Jew is for the following three halachas as a leniency. First of all, mama are just like making Erev is as long as you have bread and you all join it together, it can even be less than the lowest denomination of currency. So too, when you're renting from the non-Jew, it could even be a token amount. It could be less even than the Shabbat Pruta. So that's one thing that we're comparing it to Eruvin as a leniency. The second thing is the mama are just like making Erev is even if the worker of the non-Jew, if the worker of the non-Jew is a Jew, as we said in the Samach Dalman Aleph, even if you can't rent from the Ein Yehudi, you could rent from the Yehudi, and that's why there was a story where he said, okay, just become friendly with him and ask him if you could put stuff in his house, then you're like some type of a shiur v'likita. If he gives an Erev, it's going to be enough. So to renting, even if, let's say, the worker of the non-Jew, if he's a non-Jew, he could go ahead and rent out the rights of his master for the dwelling in the chutzner. So that's what we're learning from Eruvin. Just like there, it could be shiur v'likita, it could be even not even the balabas. Not even the owner, just a guy who's a worker. So too regarding renting, which again, the Erev part is regarding when the worker is a Jew, and here is regarding when the worker is a non-Jew. And the third thing is, just like making Erev chamisha shrim b'chatzar achas. When you have 5 people dwelling in one courtyard, one guy can make an Erev for them all. Meaning, what does that mean? Rashi says, for example, when there's 2 courtyards and there's an opening between the 2 courtyards. So first, what happens is you make your own Erev in your own courtyard. Then you want to get even bigger. You want to join the 2 courtyards together. So what you do is one guy takes the Erev from this city, which they already joined together, and he's the agent for everyone else in this courtyard. And he, like we say later on, the the 5 people collect their own Erev, and when they go into another place, one guy takes them and he brings it to the other chutzner, and now we'll all join together in the chutzner. So you see that it can be done through one person. It doesn't have to be every single guy in this courtyard has to bring down their bread to the other courtyard. One guy can do it for all. So regarding renting, chamisha, 5 Yisraelim, Shesruin, that are living with a non-Jew, b'chatzar achas, one courtyard, echad seicher, one of the Jews could rent from the non-Jew, alei for them all, and therefore that's what we're comparing the halacha of schiras to Eruvin. It's for this following 3 leniencies, but not difficult on Rabbi Yochanan, because yes, we will compare schiras to Bit Rishus regarding being done on Shabbos, only comparing to Eruvin for the following 3 leniencies. Now that was one question. The problem is Toyba means that like he was analyzing and he was thinking and he was wondering about the understanding of this. Rabbi Lazar was trying to figure out this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan, that he said there was these 2 steps that we said are being allowed. There's the renting from the non-Jew on Shabbos, and then after you rented from the non-Jew, as we said, the Erev is not here anymore, because the Erev becomes batal once the non-Jew comes back on Shabbos. So the question is, what do you do then? So Rabbi Yochanan says, okay, there's 2 things you're doing. In addition to renting the Rishus of the non-Jew in Shabbos, then subsequently all Jewish residents must have been about Rishus to one person. Because besides the non-Jew now, you don't have an Erev, because the Erev was undone by the non-Jew coming at Shabbos. So Mevatli Rishus to one guy, it's like he's the only guy here. If there's only one guy, then you can carry from his house to the Chatzah. The problem is that Rebbe Lazar found this interesting. He was wondering about this teaching. Now, it doesn't tell us what he wondered. On that, Rebbe Zera says, Matoid Rebbe Lazar. What was Rebbe Lazar wondering? Some of Shesha says, Gava Rabba Rebbe Zera, a great person like you, Rebbe Zera. Well, Yoda Matoid Rebbe Lazar. You don't know what Rebbe Lazar was bothered by? Kakashla, you know what he was bothered by was the Shmuel Rabbi. Rabbi Yechanan's teaching seems to contradict the teaching of his Rabbi Shmuel. Because the Amar Shmuel said, and ultimately, what we're going to show is that it's going to be inconsistent with the criteria of Bittul Rishus taught by his Rabbi Shmuel. Because the Gemara is going to conclude that there's a machlekes Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan. Shmuel held that the Chacham only allowed Bittul Rishus, as we're going to quote right now, many different cases, that has to have 2 criteria. They could have made an Erev, and since they did not, they were restricted from the onset of Shabbos, meaning that's going to be Asr. In that case, you could do Bittul Rishus. Rabbi Yochanan, as we're going to show, holds that either condition suffices to utilize Bittul Rishus. And therefore, we're going to see that that's what bothered Rabbi Lazar, that Rabbi Yochanan is not like his teacher, Shmuel. So the Gemara quotes the 3 different cases that are mentioned by Shmuel, and that one of the cases contradicts this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan. That's the difficulty Rabbi Lazar had. How could Rabbi Yochanan say, not like his Rabbi Shmuel? What's these 3 teachings? Rabbi Shmuel says like this: Chamakim sha'esrin, wherever these 2 areas make it forbidden one on the other if they don't make an Erev. And Arvin, meaning, if they wanted to make an Erev, they can make an Erev. So there's two criterion over here we're mentioning. One is that, and the Gemara will explain what the case is, but one is that they can make an Erev, and if they don't, they can be also one on the other. Then Mevatlan. Then, if let's say they forgot and they did not make an Erev, then they can mevatel their shus to one of those, and it's like, then the chutz is going to be totally like his, and then it's going to be permitted to carry in the whole courtyard as long as they don't carry from the other people's houses to the courtyard, only from that one person's, because then it's considered like his courtyard. They are mevatel their shus, they have no right from the courtyard, they can't carry it from their house. As long as they carry it only from his house, then you could carry on Shabbos. But the bittul could only be if you have those two criterion. Oisrin, if they don't make an Erev, they can be aser, and Ma'arvin, if they wanted to, they could have made an Erev. Case number two is, let's say Ma'arvin. Let's say they could make an Erev, but they ain't Oisrin. If they don't make an Erev, it's not going to be forbidden. Or case number three, let's say Oisrin. Let's say actually if they don't make an Erev, it's going to be forbidden, but they ain't Ma'arvin. They don't even have the choice of making the Erev. Then they're also imavat, you cannot make the bittul. So ultimately, again, what we see from Shmuel is there has to be two criteria: Eisrin, Uma Arvin. Then you can make bittul. But if it's only Eisrin by Ema Arvin, Uma Arvin, and not Eisrin, then you cannot do bittul. Now the Gemara explains these three cases. Says the Gemara, and then we're going to prove from the last case what's difficult. That Shmuel is not like Rabbi Shloimy. Says the Gemara like this: the first halacha was Kalmokam Sha'isrin Uma Arvin. Wherever they make it problematic one on the other, and they could make an Erev. Then if let's say they forgot to make an Erev, they could do bittul. Kugoyin, this is, as the Bach brings the picture, or we have the picture over here, is that Beis Chatzer Zuluf no Mizu. If you have two courtyards, one within the other, meaning if the inner courtyard did not make its own Erev, the inner courtyard is going to make it problematic for the outer courtyard, as Rashi explains, even according to Rabbana who disagree with Rabbi Kiva. They agree when it's regular, what's called Hasur B'Mkayma. These guys in the inner courtyard, they can't carry over here because they didn't make an Erev for themselves. Then they're going to make it also what's called Shaloi B'Mkayma in the outer courtyard because of what we call Drisus Regel, the right of way they have in the outer courtyard. Now, so that's Oisr. They're going to make it problematic. Now, if they wanted to, you have the second criteria. They could be Ma'arvin. That's what we're saying. It's Oisr U'Ma'arvin. They make it problematic, and they could make an Erev. If they forgot, did not make an Erev, then you have the third criterion, Mavatlan, then the inner courtyard could nullify their rights into the Drisus Regel in the outer courtyard. And then, that's the case where you can have the halacha, they can be Mavatlan their rishus. That was case number one. Case number two is Ma'arvin, they could make an Erev, but they ain't Eisrin, but if they don't make an Erev, they're not going to make it problematic. Ein Mavatlan, then you cannot make bittul. Kugoyin. Here also, but the Bach brings the second picture, the picture like we have, is Beis Chatzeres. You have two courtyards that open up into a Mavai or into the Rishos Rabbim, Upesach Echad Benein, and they have the opening side by side, open one into the other. Now, if they want to, they can make an Erev, they could join together. If they don't make an Erev with each other, then they're each going to be individually permitted because there's no right of way over here. There's a different way that they can get out. Oh, that's a case where, according to Shmuel, you're not going to be able to mevatel because you have to have both criteria. Now we're up to the third, and this is, as we're going to point out, the agrees because one condition exists, and that's sufficient that they could have made a joint Erev. According to Rabbi Yechon, as we're going to see, that is enough criteria to mevatel. He only needs one of the two. But the main point comes from the next case. Oisrin, let's say they would make it forbidden one on the other, but they can't make an Erev together. Then Allah says, Shmuel, again, you have to have both criteria, and you only have one. Then you cannot do bittul. Says the Gemara, this was what was bothering Rebbe Lazar, is Yomai, this teaching of Shmuel, the third case. What's it coming to include? Where do you ever have that they can make it problematic one another and you cannot make an Erev? Lav Nachri, isn't it coming to include it when it's by the non-Jew, which is, if he dwells with two Yisraelim in the courtyard, that you have the Eisrin, he's going to make it problematic for the two Yisraelim one on the other, because as we know, when the Nachri is there, it makes it problematic. But you don't have the other criteria, you cannot make an Erev. Why can't you make an Erev? Because of the Nachri. You can't make a Nachri, you can't make it when the Nachri is there. And you see Shmuel says that Eim of Atlan. So wait a second, the Gemara is going to conclude the right. The Idas, now if the case where the non-Jew came etmol from before Shabbos, why calling it Eisrin Ve'im Arvin? What do you mean, Loiger Me'etmol? What do you mean, they could have made an Erev, if they would have rented the rights from the non-Jew Erev Shabbos, you could have made an Erev on Erev Shabbos. So why is this case called, if the Nachri is there, that it's Eisrin Ve'im Arvin? Rather, to continue in Beis, rather, isn't it talking about the Asa b'Shabbat? It must be talking about where he came on Shabbos. If he comes on Shabbos, you can't make an Erev because he's not there to rent it from him. And B'Katani we learned, Oishin ve'ema arvin. It says that it's going to be problematic as the non-Jews there, and you can't make an Erev that ema vatmun. So you see that Brit Rishus was only instituted only where you could have made an Erev from before Shabbos, which Trace actually explains. The reason why we're calling it ema arvin is, what do you mean? The story even was that they made an Erev from before Shabbos. Because the non-Jew wasn't there, like Rabbi Yehuda. You actually could make an Erev. That's why calling it, if he comes on Shabbos, that ema arvin, says Trace, no. Because Lamaisa, when he comes on Shabbos, the Erev is undone, is bottle, and it doesn't go back to what it originally was. So even if they subsequently rent from him, that's called Isim ve'ema arvin, because you can't really make the Erev, because when he's going to come back, it's not going to be maintained. You're not going to be able to bring it back to what it was. So therefore, that's called Isim ve'ema arvin. Akapanim, you see when he comes on Shabbos, the halacha is that ema vatman. Shema minos. Obviously, you hear from this that was the difficulty Rabbi Elazar had with Rabbi Yechanan. Rabbi Yechanan said that you're allowed to go ahead and rent the rights and mavatal the rishos. So originally we had asked the question on the first halacha of Rabbi Yechanan regarding the seicher. He seemed to contradict himself. We said no, it's not a contradiction. Then we asked on the second part of it, which then he says, okay, after you rent the rights from the non-Jew, then you'll be mavatal the rishos to one Jew. The problem is we see that from his Rebbe Shmuel, you cannot be mavatal when you have Eisrin ve'ema arvin. In this case of Eisrin ve'ema arvin, that was the question that Rabbi Elazar had on the teaching of Rabbi Yechanan. But as we're going to prove shortly, that Rabbi Yechanan did disagree with this teaching of Shmuel, and therefore that's why he disagreed. And he says that you could be seicher and mavatal on Shabbos. I'm Rav Yisrael, but first the Gemara brings it like this. Rav Yisrael says, "Lo shmi li hashmaiti." He says, "I didn't hear this teaching of Shmuel. Which one?" Shmuel said 3 cases. The first case, Shmuel said, "Kol she'osin ma'arvin mavatal." He says, whatever would make it forbidden, and you didn't make an Erev, but you could have made an Erev, then you could do bittul, which we said is the case of when you have 2 courtyards, one within the other, that then the inner courtyard could nullify their drisas, their right of way in the outer courtyard, which was the first halacha. Said Dres, I didn't hear this teaching. So Amalei Abai says, what do you mean? At Amrit Nahalan. What do you mean? You told us this teaching of Shmuel, because as Rashi brings, that Rav Yosef actually became ill, and he forgot his learning, and Rabbi Abai, his student, would remind him. He says, you told us this teaching of Shmuel, and you told us in another context, this teaching of Shmuel. Dama Shmuel, because Shmuel had said the following teaching, and we'll see from the way Rav Yosef qualified it, that obviously he knew this first halacha because he himself said it. Shmuel said 2 teachings. He says, in bitul rishus mechatz l'chatz, says that you cannot go ahead and do a nullification of rights if it's from one courtyard to another courtyard. You could do it in the same courtyard. If, let's say, 5 people living in the same cul-de-sac, one guy forgot to make an Erev, he could nullify, but to another courtyard you cannot. And second of all, you cannot do a nullification of rights in a churva. Meaning, if let's say you have a house on either side, and then you have a dilapidated building between the 2 of them, and both houses have an opening up into that common dilapidated house between them, so you're not allowed to use that area unless you make an Erev, because that's rights that they both have that they have to join together. So on that says Shmuel, you cannot nullify your rights one to the other to permit the other one to go in and to carry out of his house into the churva, because Rabbanah only permitted bit of rishos only when it's the courtyard in front of the house, because that's what Rabbanah lenient, because that's the primary utility. So by a chatzah they permitted, but by a churva, which is not the primary area, that they never gave that halacha of bit rishos. And again, even by that of chatzah, has to be that same chatzah, not another chatzah. Now, regarding that teaching, va'amrit lan Allah, and you told us in the explanation of that halacha, when the Shmuel say ein bit rishos mechatz l'chatz, that there's no nullification of rights from one courtyard to another one, lo we only said it, elo shtei chatzeros u'pesach echad beineihem. That's only when you have 2 courtyards with an opening between them. Where that's a case of loy oisrin. You can make ma'arvin, it's ma'arvin, but ve'ein oisrin, because there's no right of way that they have over here. That's where you said, Shmuel said, that you cannot move out from one rishos to another rishos. But if you have one within the other, then you told us, you Rabbi Yosef, I said, you're saying you never heard the halacha, you told us, since the inner courtyard actually makes it forbidden on the outer courtyard, if they did not make an Erev together because of their right away, what's called Drisas Regel, you told us that Shmuel would agree them a Vatlan, that then they could nullify their right of way if they did not make an Erev the inner courtyard by themselves, which then they're regular Asur b'Mekayma, and then they make it forbidden even Shloi b'Mekayma until they nullify that you said in Shmuel that you could nullify. So you yourself said this halach of Shmuel that you could be mavatal when it's Eisin Ma'arvin, even if it's a different courtyard. So Malay, so that Rav says, I said such a teaching in the name of Shmuel? How could that even be? I couldn't have said it. Because Shmuel says there's a different teaching in quotes from Shmuel. Ein lama be'eruvin. We don't have to add on any more heterim in the laws of Eruvin. Ela kalashon Mishnah saying. Only like the words we have in our Mishnayos. Now, in our Mishnayos, we have later on the Samach Tesla Beis that the Mishnah says Anshe Chatzar, the people of a courtyard. What was the case in the Mishnah that Mishnah describes by Bittul Rishus? It's talking about when the people of one courtyard, one of the people forgot. So then we said he could give his rights off to other people. So it says Rav Yosef, what do you see from Shmuel's teaching? You can't do more than what the Mishnah says. V'lo Anshe Chatzeros. It could only be the people of a courtyard, singular, not people of courtyards. So obviously you see that by one courtyard we learn bittul, and not by two different courtyards. So Rashi explains this conclusion of explaining that it says in the Mishnah Anshe Chatzar and not Anshe Chatzeros. It's not Shmuel who said this. So Yosef, who's being medayik from the words of Shmuel only said like we say in the Mishnah. So what do we say? In the Mishnah it says it has to be one courtyard, but by two courtyards you cannot do, which that obviously is even when you have Zelef Nimizeh. So if he says, how could Shmuel have said this? That you can do Bittul Rishus when it's what's called Eisun Ma'arvin, when you have one within the other. What do you mean? But Shmuel said that we can't say more than what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says it's only Anshe Chatzar, singular, not Anshe Chatzeros. You can't do Bittul Rishus from one courtyard to another courtyard. So obviously he didn't say it even when it's Zelef Nemizeh. So how could I have said that? I never heard this other teaching, this other version that we're saying in the name of Shmuel. Which I said to him, no, it's not true. When did you tell us this teaching of Shmuel? Of Ein Lon Eruvin El Kolosh Mishnah is saying that we only have about Eruvin only as we say in the Mishnah. It's not on the words of Anshe Chatzar, because it's not true. You could be Mavat Rishus from one Chatzar to another Chatzar if it's Zelef Nemizeh where it's Eisim Ma'arvin. You actually told us that Diik Aha Amatlan. You told us regarding a different Mishnah. And the Mishnah Daf Ayin Gimel on the base. The Mishnah says, the laws of an alleyway in regards to courtyards is kachatzel bottom is like how a courtyard is to houses. Meaning, Shmuel was being medayik in the lashon of a different Mishnah of chatzeris and bottom. As the Gemara teaches us later on, that a mavoi is not going to be considered as halachic alleyway to be permitted with a lechi b'kaira, which that's leniencies in the alleyway that you could just put up a side post or a crossbeam, until you have house and courtyards open up to it, which you have two courtyards into the mavoi, and every courtyard has two houses open up into it, which is just like a courtyard only has permitted if you have houses open up to it. So the mavoi is only permitted if you have courtyards open up to it. That's the lashon of the Mishnah that we said that you only can be lenient like that, but not that other Mishnah of Anshe Chatzar. And therefore, Rabbi says not true. The halacha is going to be that Shmuel does hold that the halacha is that you could make a bittul rishus from one chatzah to another chatzah as long as it's oisin ma'arvin. Then you can do bittul. If it's only oisin but not ma'arvin, or ma'arvin not oisin, then you cannot do. But you could do it if it's zelif nemizeh, not like what Rabbi Yosef had quoted. Now, Gufa, the Gemara goes back to point out what we had originally mentioned that Rabbi Yechanan disagrees with Shmuel in the second scenario. That's what Rabbi Lazar was wondering. How could he say this? But that we're going to actually bring it that actually Rabbi Yechanan does clearly disagree. We mentioned before that Shmuel says, you cannot nullify rights from one courtyard to another courtyard. There's no nullification of rights when it's regarding a churva between the two of them. Now, but Rabbi Yechanan disagrees on both. He says, yes, bittul rishus mechatz l'chatz. He says you could do bittul rishus from one domain to another domain. That's what we said previously from the previous stuff, which you said Rabbi Yechanan said that you could be soichrin from the non-Jew and be mevatlin, even though that's a case of oisin ve'ema arvin, which is only one criterion. That's what we said Rabbi Yechanan disagrees with is Rabbi Shmuel. And also on the other halacha, the yeshbet rishus b'churva, that there's also you could be nullifying your rights in the churva that the other person could carry from his house to the churva. Rabbi Yechanan also disagrees over there. So we have to say the machlekes Rabbi Yechanan and Shmuel by both cases. Why? We only said we're going from one courtyard to another courtyard. There Shmuel would say that you cannot do bittul because this courtyard is independent. In this courtyard it has its own independent function. Therefore, there are two independent areas. You cannot nullify one to the other. Regarding this churva, the dilapidated building, were there. That one utility of the churva functions for both, because both houses use that area. It's their common area, and therefore it's going to make it forbidden one than the other. I would say Shmuel agrees that you could be mevatel there. So therefore we have to say there too. And the same thing is in reverse. We only said the case of the churva. But how come Rabbi Yochanan says that there's bittul? Because it's a common area for both. But we're going to two different courtyards. Moidli Lishma would say he agrees to Shmuel that no, that you cannot do bittul because they're all independent areas. So we have to say the machlekes between Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel in regards to both these cases. Now, we're going to go one step deeper here. Amar Abaye. There's the machlekes actually Abaye and Rava. What we said up until now was Rav Yosef, which Abaye holds like Rav Yosef. But there's actually machlekes Abaye and Rava regarding this teaching that we just mentioned of Shmuel. Amar Abaye. Abaye says, Hadam Shmuel, this that Shmuel said, Ein bittul rishus mechutz l'chatzah, that you cannot be mevatel right from one chatzah to another chatzah. Look, meaning again, what the case is when you have five, let's imagine a cul-de-sac, two cul-de-sacs opening to the other one. You have 5 houses in each one. So the people in one cul-de-sac, they each make an eruv. If they didn't, so one guy forgot to make an eruv, he could be mevatel rishus to the rest of the guys in development, and then they could continue carrying. Let's say there's another courtyard that they want to all be one big large area to carry. So then they make an eruv with them too. Let's say one guy forgot in one courtyard, so the halach is he cannot nullify his rights to the other courtyard. That's the halach. We're in the same courtyard, yeah, but in another one he cannot do. Now that comes to Abaye, he qualifies, says, that was only said regarding when you have two courtyards side by side with an opening between them. Like we said, because that's only going to be ma'arvin but ve'ein oisrin. When you have the case of two courtyards opening one within the other, then says Abaye, Shmuel would hold, and we quoted this before. If the inner courtyard did not make its own air for itself, where it's considered a regular sur b'mekayma, it cannot carry by itself over here. So even the Rabban would agree that it's iser shalei b'mekayma. So since it makes it forbidden on the outer one, and they could have made an air, so mevatlan, then the inner courtyard, if they forgot to make an air, they could be mevatlan their rights of way in the outer courtyard, and then the outer courtyard would be permitted to carry by itself. That's Abaye. But Rava disagrees. Rava Amai says, he says, even this case of the two courtyards, one within the other, sometimes they could nullify. Sometimes they cannot nullify, even though they can make it problematic for the outer courtyard. Sometimes they cannot nullify. How so? So he explains. And this is a little bit more complicated. So it says Rabbi like this. Here we're going to talk about 4 different cases. Nosnu Eruvin b'chitzayna. If let's say they placed their Eruv in the outer courtyard. So Rashi explains. Says the norm was when you would have 2 courtyards going ahead and joining together. So the Eruv that each one had made for themselves to permit in their own private courtyard, when they want to go make now a total joint area, the area of one courtyard would take it and bring it into the other courtyard. They wouldn't make another Eruv. They would just take their Eruv and bring it to the other one. Now we're all joined together. So now says Rabbi, let's say they, the inner ones, placed their Eruv together with their Eruv in the outer courtyard. Now, so they all made a joint Eruv, and here it is in the outer courtyard. The problem is v'shachach echad. One of the members, and there's 2 cases in this one case. Bein min ha'pnimis, whether it's one of the inner people, or bein min ha'chitzayna, whether it's one of the outer people. V'lo Eruv, and he forgot to join the Eruv. So shtei asuris. Both courtyards are going to be forbidden, and it's not going to be effective to do a bittul, as the Gemara is going to explain later on. Those are 2 cases. Whether the inner or the outer courtyard, one of the members forgets to make an Eruv. Case number 3. Let's say they placed the Eruv in the inner courtyard. So the outer courtyard, they went and they brought their Eruv in the inner courtyard, and now it's here in the inner one. So now we're all together here in the inner one. And then one of the people inside the inner courtyard forgot to join the Eruv. Both courtyards are going to be forbidden, and here also bittul is not going to be effective. Case number 4. In this last case, where the Eruv is in the inner courtyard, not the inner courtyard, one of the people in the outer courtyard forgot to join the Eruv, then here it's going to be different. Here, penimis muteris, here the inner courtyard could end up being permitted through the bittul that the outer courtyard is going to do, because the outer courtyard hadn't placed their Eruv in the inner courtyard, and then that gives them the right of way as if they're dwelling in the inner courtyard and making it forbidden on the inner courtyard because of what's called regular Asur b'Mekayma. They're forbidden here because the one guy over here who did not join the Erev, he's going to make it forbidden Shaloi b'Mekayma, meaning in the inner courtyard, because they have a right of way over here because this is where the Erev is. And that's what Rabbi says. Here's where Shmuel would agree. That's going to be the one case where Mavatlan. That's when they could nullify their right of way into the inner courtyard. Then the inner one's going to be permitted. But we have many cases of even if you have Oisin Mavatlan, Oisin Ma'arvin, that you're not going to be able to, you're not going to Mavatl. It's going to be, that's why it's Pom Mavatlan, Pom Ma'im Mavatl. Sometimes, as we mentioned, you're not going to be Mavatl, but sometimes, like this last case we described, then they could be Mavatl from Chatzah to Chatzah. So, and the inner one's going to be permitted, but the Chitzay Nasur, the outer courtyard, is going to remain forbidden because, again, over here they don't have an Erev. They just are nullifying their rights over here, so they're not going to make it problematic in the inner one, but here they have one member that he didn't make an Erev, and even if he's Mavatl as Rishuz, but it doesn't help because the Erev is over here in the inner courtyard, and they don't have an Erev out over here. The Gemara is going to go through these cases to explain them one by one. But again, one thing is we see that Rava disagrees with Abaye regarding the qualification of Shmuel's teaching of if you could be Mavatl Mechatz L'Chatzer, sometimes yes, sometimes not. Unlike Abaye who said you could always be Mavatl from when it's the case of Oisin Ma'arvin, when it's Zulaf Nemizul. So the Gemara explains. Case number one. Eruvin B'Chitzayna. Let's say they placed their Erev in the outer courtyard. Then one of the guys forgot. And whether it's a guy from the inner courtyard or a guy from the outer courtyard, one of them forgot and did not make an Erev. So on that, Rabbi says, Shtei Asuras, they're both going to be forbidden. So the Gemara explains why. Because Hai Bar Panim is this guy from the inner courtyard. Case number one. In that case number one, there's two cases. Who's the guy who forgot? The guy who forgot is, let's say, the inner one. He didn't join the Erev. Laman Nevatel, who should he go and nullify his rights to? As the Gemara explains. If you're going to tell me Levatel B'nei Panimis that he should nullify his rights to the guys in the inner courtyard who is in the chutzah that he lives in, that the inner one should be permitted for themselves. And yes, the outer one should remain forbidden because of the rights away that the inner one has on the outer one, which is going to be a problem because of this one guy who he's Asur b'Mekayma because he did not join in the Erev. So although the inner ones they could carry because he didn't Mavatl his rights, but the outer one would still be forbidden because he that one guy has no rights. He's Asur b'Mekayma. He can't carry over here, so he's going to make it. He's going to make it Oisir Shalei b'Mekayma on the outer courtyard. But at least maybe the inner courtyard could be permitted because he'll nullify his rights to them. Says the Gemara, no. Lesele Ravai Gabayu. Their Erev is not by them in the inner courtyard. They can't separate themselves from the outer courtyard because then they'll be without an Erev, and then they're all going to be forbidden one on the other. So you can't nullify his rights to them, and then they could, so to speak, block off the door and be permitted over here because the Erev is in the outer courtyard. So what are you going to say? Okay, so Lavata, let him also nullify his rights away. This one guy forgot to make the Erev. If he lives in the inner courtyard, L'bnei Chitzayna, to the people who live in the outer courtyard. Let him totally remove himself, and then let everyone be permitted. No, because you cannot nullify your rights if you're one member of a member of one courtyard to a member of another courtyard, according to Shmuel, even though it's going to make it forbidden on the outer courtyard. That is Rabbi Shita and Shmuel, like we said, not like Abaye. Now Rashi says, wait a second, why can't you go ahead and let all the other people of the inner courtyard nullify their rights to this guy who did not make the Erev? Then he'll be a regular mutter b'mekaymai, because he's an individual, and he's not going to make it forbidden on the outer courtyard and let the outer courtyard be permitted. He says, no, well, you can't say that, because if all the people are nullifying their rights to that one guy who forgot to join the Erev, then they are regular Asur b'mekayma. As the Mishnah teaches later on in Samach Tes and Beis, when they give their rights away, he's permitted, but they're forbidden, and then they're going to make it forbidden on the outer courtyard. Now, although, they had made an Erev with the outer courtyard, yeah, but they're nullifying their Erev from the moment that they go ahead and they give up their rights in the inner courtyard. So although that they don't have rishus to go ahead and carry out from their house to the chutzner, but they're still going to have a right of way in the inner courtyard and the outer courtyard, and they're going to make it problematic. And if you're going to say they should nullify their right of way to the outer courtyard, you can't do it with rishus, machatz l'chatz. So again, therefore, that's why it doesn't work in that case. Now, in that same case, there was a second case. Let's say the one who forgot to join the Erev was the guy from the outer courtyard, not the inner courtyard. So here also, Laman Nevatel, to who should he nullify his rights? If you're going to say Levatel b'nei Chitzayna, let him nullify his rights to where he lives in the outer courtyard to those people, it could pinimis to asalai. What do you mean? You have the people of the inner courtyard who make it forbidden on them, because what happens is this one guy who did not join the Erev, he makes the Erev as if it's not good. If that's the case, the people of the inner courtyard are what's called a regular surubim coming. They can't carry over here because the Erev is not here, it's in the outer one. And he didn't join in the Erev. So therefore, if he's going to try to nullify to the people of the outer one, the people in the inner courtyard are going to nullify the Erev. Oh, and if you're going to say, okay, okay, let him give up his rights, not just to the outer courtyard, but also to the people in the inner courtyard. No, you cannot nullify your rights. So one courtyard done it. That's not going to work either. Case number 3. If they put the Erev in the inner courtyard, and we said the shachach echad min hapanimis v'la Erev, and one of the inner guys forgot to not make an Erev, they also said shtei asuros. Why? As the Gemara explains, hai ba panimis laman levatel. All the first 3 cases are all the same idea. Who are you going to nullify to? Levatel b'nei panimis. If you're going to say, okay, let him nullify his rights in the inner courtyard, but but you have the people in the outer courtyard to make it forbidden, because we said since they put the Erev in the inner courtyard, they have a right of way to their bread in the inner courtyard too. If you can say nullify your rights to the outer courtyard, you can't nullify your rights from, if you're a member of one courtyard, to the members of the other courtyard. So since the inner courtyard is going to be forbidden, the outer courtyard is also going to be forbidden, because it's considered, the inner courtyard is considered regular asur bim kaima. They can't carry over here, which makes it forbidden on the people of the outer courtyard. And also, the Erev for the outer courtyard is not next to them, it's only here in the inner courtyard. So everyone's going to be forbidden in that 3rd case. Now, however, what was the 4th case that we said that Rabbi would say that that's where bittul would work mechatzer l'chatzer? As you can see in the Rav Samach Zayin Manaf. Shachach echad mitzad, we said the 4th case was, which was really the 2nd case of the 2nd case. There was really 2 cases. And each case had, who's the guy who forgot? The inner courtyard, the outer courtyard. Now we're the 2nd of the 2nd case, which is the 4th case. Shachach echad min hachitzayin b'le'er. If one of the people in the outer courtyard forgot, and he did not join the Erev when the Erev is in the inner courtyard, so again, the guy is over here, he forgot to join the Erev, and everyone put their Erev in the courtyard, that's the case that Rabbi says Shmuel would agree that then you could do bittul. Because Vade Panimis Materis, here for sure the people in the inner courtyard will be permitted. Why? Because the people of the outer courtyard will nullify their rights to the people of the inner courtyard, although they have a right of way over here. Because they put the Erev over here, that's like a shvacha, it's like a weaker right of way, because you don't really go over here, you usually come out here. Your only right of way is because you put the Erev over here. That's the case that we could say, okay, we don't want your Erev anymore, and then you have no right of way over here. That's going to be the case of when you have Zelav and Mizrah, that then the inner courtyard is going to be permitted. Why? Because the Achta Dasha Mishtamsh, we say we're closing the door, and the inner courtyard are using the inner area. The Chitzayin Asura, and the outer courtyard, they're going to remain forbidden, because the inner courtyard could tell the outer courtyard what's called Leskune Shetaftich B'Loi Lavasi, as we're going to say at the end of the parak. I only made you as an Erev to join with me to make things better for me, not to make things worse for me. And therefore, you're only making it worse by having your Erev over here. I don't need your Erev anymore. I'm closing the door. Closing the door. This guy who forgot, who lives over here, could be mevatel. This guy who lives over here in the outer one, he could go ahead and mevatel his rights to the inner courtyard. That's what we're going to say. That you could even say it's Zelef and Mizeh, because we could lock off the door. Now, Rashi just points out, this said you need to have bittul, that's only going according to Rabbi Kiva, that's who Rabbi was going like, because according to Rabbanan, even without bittul, the inner courtyard could tell that to the outer courtyard and uplift the Erev, because they're making it worse. But according to Rabbi Kiva, as we'll see at the end of the parak, according to him is who you need to do bittul. But again, if the person of the inner courtyard, if he forgot, then you can't say that, to say that let him nullify his rights in the courtyard and close off the door. Because then you can't say because who's the one that messed it up? It's one of your members of the inner courtyard. You can't say you're locking this out. If one of the members of the outer courtyard, he's the guy who forgot, then you can say, look, you guys are messing it up. One of your guys forgot to join. I don't need you anymore. You made it worse. We're closing the door. We could go ahead, and these guys in the outer courtyard could do the bittul over here. Then the inner ones could carry. Then you could do this halacha, a bittul, from one rishos to another rishos. Something to discuss in today's daf, in Eruvin Daf, Samach Vav, was a machlekes if schiris, renting from a non-Jew, is like bittul rishos, which then we said you could do it even on Shabbos, because bittul rishos you could do, or is it like the laws of Erev, which you cannot do on Shabbos? Now, we said there's no contradiction in the opinion of Rabbi Yechon himself, where although he said that you could go ahead and rent the rights on Shabbos, but didn't he say that seicher is k'ma'arif? What do you mean? Ma'arif is that you can't do it on Shabbos. He said no. The comparison to Ma'arif is only as a leniency with the following 3 halachas. One, it could even be less than a Shabbat Bruta. Two, it could even be schir v'lichita. You could rent it from his worker. And also that one guy could do for them all, but for the laws of Shabbos, that he compares it to Bittul Rishus, not like the laws of Erev. Now, but what we said is difficult, which Rabbi Elazar found difficult, is from his Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Yochanan is not like Rabbi Shmuel, which the Gemara ultimately showed that he does disagree. Because Shmuel said three cases. He says, wherever you have the two criteria of Eishim, if they don't make an Erev, they can make it forbidden one another. And if they want, they can make an Erev. That's the one case you can do Bittul. For example, when you have two courtyards, one within the other, we said one within the other, that's when they have the right of way, it's Eishim, and they can make an Erev. That's when you can go ahead and be Mavatal. But let's say you have Ma'arvin, but Ein Eishim, then you cannot do Bittul. What case is that? For example, when you have two courtyards and you have an opening between them, in that case, you can make an Erev, but if they don't make an Erev and not make it forbidden one on the other, or let's say you have Eishim, but not Ma'arvin, then you cannot Mavatal. What case is that going to include? It's going to include the non-Jew. Now, if it came before Shabbos, now how can you say it's considered a case of Ein Ma'arvin? They actually could make an Erev, because they could rent the rights and then make it the Erev. Obviously, with the case of Ein Ma'arvin, just talking about where it came on Shabbos, and Shmuel is telling me that then in that case, what's called Eishim Ein Ma'arvin, you cannot be Mavatal. So you see, not like Rabbi Yochanan, that's exactly the case of Rabbi Yochanan, where they came on Shabbos. And he says, B'Seicha the Rishus. So that's what Rabbi Elazar was wondering. That seems like Rabbi Yochanan is not like his Rabbi Shmuel. And the Gemara can be brought that Rabbi Yochanan does disagree. Rabbi Yosef also, although he says, I don't remember this teaching of Shmuel, Abaye showed him that he himself taught this first halacha of Shmuel, which is the case of Eishim Ma'arvin, that then you could do the Bittul, was because he himself taught a teaching of Shmuel. Shmuel said you cannot do Bittul Rishus from one chatzar to another chatzar, and that you cannot do Bittul Rishus in a churva. Rabbi Yosef himself qualified, and that's what Abaye was saying. What do you mean? You yourself told us this teaching of Shmuel, because you said that it was only when it's between them. But if let's say one within the other, then you said that Shmuel would hold that you could be Mavatal. So you see, you yourself said the teaching that when it's Eishim Ma'arvin, then you could do Bittul. But then the Gemara says, wait a second, but didn't Shmuel himself say, and that's what Rabbi Yochanan, that's what Rabbi Yosef himself will say, how could I have said that? Shmuel himself says that Ein Lon Lahater Mi Mishnah say we can't permit more than that Mishnah said, and it says Anshe Chatzah, which is in the singular. How could I have said in the name of Shmuel that you could do Bittul Rishus Mechatzah Chatzah? It says only in the singular, but not Bechatzei Reis. No, Abaye told him, you told us that was only regarding a different Mishnah, that Mavir Lechatzei Reis is going to be Kechatzah Labatim. That just like a chatzah is only permitted when this house is opening up to it, a mav is only permitted when you have chatzah to open up there, but it wasn't in regard to the other mission. You could do Bittul Rishus from one chatzah to another chatzah. Now, in regard to this teaching, that Rabbi Yosef said that Shmuel had said that you cannot do Bittul Rishus from chatzah to chatzah, and you cannot do Bittul Rishus b'churva, that's where we had that Rabbi Yochanan was quoted that no, he does disagree. Rabbi Yochanan disagrees, and he says that you could do Bittul Rishus from chatzah to chatzah. And even if it's a case of Eishim ve'im Ma'arvin or Ma'arvin ve'in Eishim, you only need one of the variables. That was the story from the previous daf where Rabbi Yochanan says, even though he came on Shabbos and non-Jew, you could be seichim the rights, and then you could do the Bittul. Bittul. That's a case of Eishim ve'im Ma'arvin. You could not have made an Erev because he wasn't here from before Shabbos. Doesn't make a difference. Only one of the criteria. And the Gemara to tell us the machlekes of Rabbi Yochanan and Shmuel regarding both, because a chatzar, each one has its own utility. A churva has one utility for both. Had I said one, I would have said that one agrees to the other in the other case. Then we had to say they disagree by both cases. Then we said regarding this halacha of Rabbi Yosef, that he qualified the teaching of Shmuel, saying that Shmuel only says his teaching you cannot do Bittul Rishus Mechatzah Chatzah only when it's between, the opening is between them. But it's one within the other, where that's the case of Eishim Ma'arvin, then you could do Bittul. That Rav actually says not like Abaye, which Abaye is the student of Yosef. Rav said, no, sometimes you could even have Zu Lefnim Mizu, and still sometimes you cannot Mavatal. Sometimes yes, sometimes not. Because we brought 4 cases regarding how Rava qualifies that 3 times you're not going to be able to do, and 1 time you will be able to do. What's the 4 cases? If let's say you have these 2 courtyards, one within the other. So you have the inner courtyard number 1 and the outer courtyard number 2. So he said, let's say they put the Eruvin in the outer courtyard, and one of the people forgot. Now there's 2 cases over here. The inner person forgot, or the outer person forgot. So then we said that, and they didn't make an Erev, we said both are going to be forbidden. Why? Because we said, who is he going to do the Bittul for? To the inner courtyard, but there's no Erev by then, because it's in the outer courtyard. To the outer courtyard, that's where Shmuel says, no, you cannot be Mavatal from one Rishus to another Rishus. That's both by the Pnimis and the Chetzayna. Case number 3 was, let's say they put the Erev in the inner courtyard, and one of them forgot, and one of them in the inner courtyard forgot and didn't join them. It's going to both be us because you can't be mevatel it from chatzah. In the inner courtyard, you can't lock it off. The fourth case was the one case that he says you could do it. Let's say they open in the inner courtyard, and one of the outer courtyards people forgot not to in Erev. That's when the inner courtyard is going to be permitted. That's when you're going to do a bittul of rishus mechatzer lachatzer. That's going to be the one case that Rabbi says that you could do it, because you could say ach kedasha mishtamsha. They could close up the door because you guys, you made it bad. Your whole right of way is because of the Erev, and one of you in the outer courtyard, you forgot to join in the Erev. We're closing the door, and therefore that's when the outer courtyard, that one guy can be matzos rishus to the inner one. That's going to be the one case that Rabbi says that Shmuel would hold. That's Machiz Bayin Rabbi to qualify. When could you say in the case of Zilma from Mizu, when you could say Bet Rishus, and when can you not? Thank you to anytime for hosting us.